the newsagents.
Finally, on the YouGov polling in today's Daily Telegraph, it says your party's facing a 1997 style election wipeout. What's your response and how can you turn it around?
There have been lots of polls over the last year. There'll be hundreds more polls. The only one that matters is the one when the general election comes. And the choice of that election is clear. It's to stick with our plan that is working. It's delivering change for people, ensuring that they can have the peace of mind that there's a brighter future for their children, that we can have renewed pride in our country, or the alternative, which is Keir Starmer and going back to square one with him. He can't say what he will do. He's been leader of the opposition for 4 years now. He hasn't said what he'd do differently, and that's because he doesn't have a plan. So that's the choice. Stick with the plan that is delivering change, making a difference, or go back to square one.
Prime Minister, thank you.
Thank you very much.
That was Rishi Sunak responding to a question from GB News' Chris Hope. It just so happens there have been this extraordinary number of coincidences this morning to start the week.
You're not being suspicious-minded.
Not at all. But in the week that the critical Commons vote on the Rwanda policy is re-entering public political discourse, a major poll has appeared in the front of the Telegraph forecasting wipeout if Rishi Sunak doesn't harden up his Rwanda bill. And just underneath that poll, you'll never believe what we saw.
No.
The former Brexit negotiator, David Frost, has commented on the poll, calling it stunning, stunningly awful, almost with relish.
So today on the Newsagents, we're going to ask what on earth is going on. Emily's going to play the part of Miss Marple. Yep. I'm going to play the part of Hercule Poirot. Yep. And we are going to investigate who done it, why they done it, and how they done it. Welcome to the Newsagents. It's John.
It's Emily.
And a little bit later on, we're going to be talking to Simon Clarke, Sir Simon Clarke, former cabinet minister, who feels that Rishi Sunak needs to go a lot further on his Rwanda policy if he's going to get his and other senior Conservatives' support in the Commons.
And what can we tell you? The surprise on all our faces this morning when we saw this massive, great prediction of YouGov, an impartial polling company, forecasting almost total 1997-style wipeout for the Conservatives. And when you look a little bit more closely at that poll, done by YouGov, you find it was commissioned by a group of Conservative donors. They're called the Conservative Britain Alliance. They're backed, we understand, by the former Brexit minister, negotiator, Lord David Frost. And then you look even more closely and you find, when was that poll commissioned? Mid-December, the very day of the second reading of the Rwanda policy in the Commons. So, as I get my Miss Marple knitting together, I am starting to wonder, ask questions, whether a certain person or group of people decided to commission the poll just at the point where they thought they could exert maximum influence on the Prime Minister to change his mind a bit and harden up the bill.
And if I was to put on my Hercule Poirot voice, I would find something very fishy as well. Indeed. Because my day started by reading the Times, and I just love the first paragraph of the Times newspaper, again, which all seems like it's acting in concert. It says that Rishi Sunak is under increasing pressure to toughen his Rwanda bill as Lee Anderson threatened to quit as the Conservative Party's deputy chairman, and Kemi Badenoch privately warned that it did not go far enough. So she privately warned it did not go far enough, and yet it's on the front page of the Times.
I hate it when that happens.
It's as though someone from her office, maybe Kemi Badenoch, maybe her special advisor, thought there was a private conversation, but then would brief it to the Times newspaper. And you just see the concerted move that is going on within the Conservative Party. Kemi Badenoch within the Cabinet, Lee Anderson, the Deputy Chair, this poll that comes out on the day before we see whether Rishi Sunak's going to get the amendments. All of this coming together. It's like there's something concerted going on there to force Rishi Sunak's hand. And we've seen it year in, year out, that the right of the Conservative Party are much better organised and well funded and are determined. And just like they were the Spartans over Brexit, so we're seeing them reforming again to force Rishi Sunak to take a tougher line on Rwanda, even though moderate Conservatives will say, you must be bloody joking. We're not going along with this.
Yeah. So if you now think back to that first clip we played you, which is a sort of phlegmatic sounding Rishi Sunak saying, oh, well, the polls will be the polls and the only one that counts is the general election. You now start to sort of understand there is the vague sense of threat in that, because I'm pretty sure that he knows what's gone on. I'm pretty sure that you don't end up in Downing Street and go, oh my goodness, this poll is terrible. I must now harden my Rwanda policy just to make sure that we don't avoid a 1997 style defeat. What Rishi Sunak is doing is probably thinking, whether with confidence or misplaced confidence, I'm going to get this bill through. Because they know that if they scupper the bill, ultimately, then general election defeat awaits them anyway. And it could be sooner rather than later.
The other thing that I think is worthy of note is that in the midst of all this, the derision towards Rishi Sunak of the Daily Telegraph. I mean, if this had been a Labour leader and that was the headline, you'd say, oh, yeah, well, that's just true to form for the Daily Telegraph. But the Daily Telegraph have also on their live page have been politics latest news. Stick with my plan, says Rishi. It's working. After dire poll results. So they're saying, really? It's working? Have you not seen the polls? So I do sense there is a jeopardy for Rishi Sunak in all of this, that papers that you could normally absolutely bank on look like they are putting maximum distance between his leadership at the moment and their support.
Yeah.
And that is a worrying place for the Conservative Party to be.
You don't need us to tell you that there are factions within the Conservative Party, and the Telegraph, if you like, faction, or the Telegraph reader faction, the faction that the paper thinks it's writing for, are the wing of the Conservatives that may vote for reform, which could take not seats, but could definitely split the vote and make it much easier for Labour to get in. That is clearly not Rishi Sunak's wing of the party. The wing of the party that he probably thinks he's got is the kind of Times reader in the middle, right? And the Times place is that gentle nudge, which is Kemi Badenoch saying, get on with it. Come on, give us what we need. On the left wing of the Conservative Party, he's got Robert Buckland, former Justice Minister. He's got Damien Green. He's got the people that we loosely call the One Nation Tories, who are basically saying, don't forget that we are your anchor to the rest of the country, if you like, and to reality. If you go further to the right with the nut jobs, as they would see it, then we will end up making life difficult for you on the left. So, yeah, it's a really uncomfortable place for Rishi Sunak, unless he just thinks, sod it, you know what, I'm going to get this bill through anyway.
Yeah, well, look, if you haven't seen the front page, that is it. It is pretty damn ugly, and it's a kind of gloomy, eyes down Rishi Sunak, looking kind of forlorn. But the article by David Frost, Lord Frost, as we should call him, is really interesting, because he also says that, people are starting to say that Brexit hasn't been a great success. And that's all the fault of this government for not getting its message across. And Remainers are starting to make the argument that Brexit's been a problem.
Yeah, let's just try and remember who was the chief architect who has possibly overlooked his own role in making the Tories, the Conservative Party, so widely despised, who has been so complacent about the pain of Brexit, who's used so much empty rhetoric on a policy that simply hasn't done what it promised.
Well, let us speak now to Paul Goodman. And if you want to put this in COVID terms, Conservative Home, which he runs, is sort of like the thermometer and the blood oxygen level of the Conservative Party. The Conservative Party needs to take its own temperature on what its blood oxygen levels are. Conservative Home is the place to find that out. And he has been fascinated and is fascinating on what the Telegraph has found. Paul Goodman, you pick up the Telegraph this morning, one of the most fiercely Conservative supporting newspapers there is, and the headline over a grim photo of Rishi Sunak is Tories facing 1997 style wipeout, all backed by a poll. Where does this poll come from?
It was such a coincidence, wasn't it?
I didn't pick up the Telegraph this morning. I saw the Telegraph yesterday evening at about 10 o'clock, and all my journalistic and Tory alarm bells began to jangle, because this story seemed to me quite extraordinary. There's a war going on in the Middle East. The sub-postmaster scandal is still sort of rolling on. But the Telegraph had cleared the front page for this story. It's got a commentary by David Frost beneath it. It's got other stories about the loss of votes to reform over immigration, individual cabinet ministers losing their seat. It's a complete journalistic romp. So I asked myself, what's going on here? And it didn't take very long, really, to work it out. Pretty clearly, at its most basic and obvious level, the intent, certainly of the Frost piece, sort of amplified, I suppose, by the coverage, is to put pressure on the government over more restrictive amendments to the Rwanda bill, which is coming before the Commons this week. Not only in relation to amendments, but also in relation to third reading. That clearly was the first and most obvious purpose of the story.
Just spell that out so people understand
what's going on here? What's going on in relation?
I mean, the second and the third. Just so
let's just explain what's going on briefly in relation to the Rwanda bill, because that would sort of make sense. So, there are a group of Conservative MPs on the right who want to make it more restrictive, and there are a group of Conservative MPs on the left of the party who either want to make it less or to see it made no more restrictive. And Rishi Sunak is here in the middle with this bill. So, in short, Downing Street appears to be not moving on any amendments. That's the situation at the moment. It's not going to give way to anyone. So you can see why, if you want a more restrictive approach, you would want to argue for it. And it just sort of seems a mighty coincidence that this poll, which presumably has taken a long time to commission and prepare, has just popped up at this particular moment.
So the poll is by YouGov, totally reputable, independent, impartial pollsters.
Yes.
But commissioned by this sort of newly founded group.
You tell me. I mean, I've not heard of them. Are they present donors? Are they perhaps, and this is the view of some people in government, are they past donors of the kind of, they like Peter Crudders say, who was a great supporter of Boris Johnson? We don't know, because no one is apparently saying.
So would it be incredibly cynical of us to start wondering if a poll had been commissioned by a group of Tory donors or former donors who wanted to change Rishi Sunak's mind on the Rwanda bill, and they waited until the night before the Rwanda bill was due back in the Commons to bring out a poll that would panic
cynical,
him
Emily.
to such a place where he changed his mind?
I don't think it's cynical. I don't think it's particularly, or indeed at all, ignoble. It's part of what one does if one's campaigning. It's true that some pollsters today, I think Anthony Wells of YouGov, they're questioning the way in which the Telegraph has interpreted part of the poll. They're arguing that there's rather more to it than the suggestion that if you don't move on immigration as the main offer, voters will go to other parties. The suggestion is there's actually rather more to the poll than that. So the interpretation of the poll is an interesting story in itself.
OK, we've got to talk about something else, though, as well, which is that you have penned an article for Conservative Home with the headline, "A Leadership Ballot, the Game's Afoot." Do you think that this is part of it as well, that there is a move to get Rishi Sunak out?
Well, I was talking about the first stage of what's going on. Pretty clearly, Lord Frost wants to see, and others want to see, the bill made more restrictive. The question is, what happens if it isn't? And I think the sort of hint is then that Conservative MPs should think very seriously about voting against the bill at third reading. Now, if the bill collapsed at third reading, please stay with me, right? This is a major defeat. The government then really has no policy on stopping the boats, not that anyone else has either, and that's another story. What happens then? So I think in those circumstances, it's possible to see how a leadership challenge could emerge. And, I think that Lord Frost and others would be perfectly well aware of this.
Do you hear a threat?
There's a certain element of threat, I feel. I mean, some of these MPs have written pieces saying, we feel ourselves to be like the Spartans during the
Brexit years.
During the Brexit years. And after all, the Spartans, in a way, this is worth thinking about, they not only helped to bring down Theresa May, but they did, actually, contrary to what a lot of people suspected at the time, they did end up delivering Brexit rather than a second referendum. That's another story.
So do you sense widespread dissatisfaction with Rishi Sunak over kind of political leadership, his political antennae, the way things are going?
Well, look, they're 18 points behind in Politico's poll of polls. It's been a rough series of old years, to put it mildly. I mean, not just with Liz Truss, Boris Johnson and all that, but with the big international picture with COVID, war in the Ukraine, now war in the Middle East. So, in a way, you didn't need this new poll to tell us that the Conservatives are not doing well in the polls. I mean, it's kind of like that line in Hamlet where Horatio says to Hamlet, "We need no ghost come from the grave, my lord, to tell us this." We didn't need this new poll to tell us that the Conservatives are well behind. What it clearly does, and I think is intended to do, is to spook individual MPs as they run their eyes down the column, look for their own seat, and begin, perhaps in the mind of those who commissioned it, to panic.
So, Paul, can we ask you what Rishi Sunak's response to this should be now? Because he knows what's going on, right? Presumably Downing Street aren't stupid. They've read the poll, they've read Frost, they now understand that the Telegraph is...
I think from just talking around this morning, for every reaction there's a counter-reaction. And I think there's a bit of a counter-reaction among some Conservative MPs, right? Some may look at this, for all I know, they may panic. They may decide it's worth putting a letter in to depose Rishi Sunak, and we can discuss that in a moment. But I think others see the game. They understand what's happening here, and they realise that pressure is being put on in relation to the amendments. They might be sympathetic to that, but they also realise pressure is being put on them in relation to third reading. They might not be so sympathetic to that.
Just explain that.
Well, they might think voting for some amendments to toughen up this bill, that's one thing. We're all up for that. Well, they might also think maybe actually that's more trouble than it's worth. And even if it's not more trouble than it's worth, we're not going to vote this bill down at third reading and cause a major crisis for the government, and perhaps bring about the very early general election that could ensure that we lose our seats. Once events start rolling like this, you don't know where they will go.
So just give me your final thought on Rishi Sunak then. Is he going to hold his nerve? Is he going to send them packing? Is he going to change? I mean, he's more scared of the right of his party than the left.
You've seen this with bills before. And the very first thing I'd say to anyone who is writing for Conservative Home tomorrow morning, were I doing it, is you never know what's going to happen at report and committee stage of bills. Governments suddenly make concessions. They bring in manuscript amendments. But Downing Street seem at the moment, perhaps wrongly, because, not everyone always calls everything right, they seem to be very confident they can win this. And I think Sunak strategically has reached the point where last year, at one point, he tried to present himself as the candidate of change. That didn't work. He's now gone to what really would always be the ground on which he was most comfortable, which is basically, I think he wants to fight a campaign that's more focused on the economy and on the sort of traditional ground of governments fighting elections, which is always better the devil you know versus the opposition's call of time for a change.
Very good to have you with us.
Fascinating.
Fascinating.
Thanks,
Come back
Paul.
again, please.
We didn't
Right.
talk about the Telegraph itself.
It's doing what the Telegraph's always done, though more than in my day, so about 100 years old. It's representing what it sees as being the interests of its readers.
Yeah.
But that does mean
And that's a
tilting
frosty.
the paper in a way that gives more space and is more sympathetic to reform,
Yeah.
as in Reform UK.
Yeah. Fascinating.
Really interesting. Thank you.
Thank you. We are joined in the studio by the former Cabinet Minister, Simon Clarke. It's great to have you with us. Thank you so much for coming in. You've seen the Telegraph poll. The Rwanda bill is coming back, and you're not happy.
Correct. I think the poll demonstrates one of the many reasons why it's so important we deliver on the Rwanda policy. Clearly, it is important in its own terms, and anyone who saw the over-weekend news about the tragic loss of life in the Channel will have been reminded there is a human tragedy behind every one of these crossings, and the loss of life in the Channel is utterly unacceptable and wrong, and we will only stop that if we fix the problem. But politically, it is almost as stark. The poll in the Telegraph is the largest that's been conducted since 2019. It is already correcting for the very high number of people who say they are currently undecided. So it attempts to correct for that that group of people who are yet to make up their minds. And it shows that even when you account for a substantial number of those people going back to the Conservatives, we are on course for a really serious defeat. And 169 seats, that's gifting control of the country to Labour probably for a decade. And we need to address the reasons why a key part of our electoral coalition has switched off or is going to reform. And the only way we do that is by showing that we are gripping the Rwanda policy, that we are actually going to stop the small boats, and that we are serious about not just talking a talk, but walking a walk.
And was that Telegraph poll a surprise to you?
Yes, it emerged over the weekend that this was in commission, and it's not as though the fact that we're behind is itself surprising. It's been a very difficult 2 years, really, for the Conservative Party.
But you knew nothing about this.
We didn't know. I mean, as of last week, I was unaware. I only became aware over the weekend. But the confluence of it is probably not a coincidence. Let's be clear. It's designed to highlight what's at stake, and I welcome the fact it's been commissioned because we need to show the wider Conservative family, but particularly Conservative MPs, that just sticking heads in the sand and sort of, kidding ourselves along, and, with huge respect to Grant Shapps, who I, admire greatly as a minister. He was on the morning round today saying, it's just another poll. The only poll that counts is election day. That is, I'm afraid, a comforting fallacy.
It's not just another poll, is it? Because that poll was commissioned on December the 12th, which, funnily enough, was the day that the Rwanda policy was in the Commons. So clearly somebody had gone out of their way to commission a poll that would be used as a vehicle to make Rishi Sunak change his mind. Do you think that's how polling should be used?
Well, I think there's no harm in using polling to spell out reality to people at all. And, the truth is there'll be polls produced by media outlets. Sometimes those have an agenda too, let's be clear. But there'll be polls which are produced on specific policy issues. And I think it is really important that we don't do what I think it is so easy to do at this point, which is to put a sort of strained, professed unity ahead of delivering the right policy outcomes. Being unified behind an inadequate policy will avail us not one jot if that poll then turns out to be the result later this year.
Simon, you quoted Grant Shapps there doing the morning round saying that the only poll that matters is the one on election day, etc. Those are exactly the words of Rishi Sunak as well this morning. Yeah. So he's got his head in the sand as well.
Well, I think the reality is,
does Rishi Sunak have his head in the sand?
Well, no, I think the reality is that these guys are incredibly intelligent and adept political operators. The Prime Minister will well know that this is a really serious poll finding. He just obviously can't say, look, this is a major problem for us and we need to do something about it. He's not going to.
Do you think
he's not going to talk in those terms?
But his lack of readiness to change position suggests, according to your argument, that he does have his head in the sand.
I think there are a number of my colleagues who are not wanting to face up to the reality of the situation that we are in. I don't believe for a moment that Number 10, which is crammed full of very able people, are in a position where they don't recognise the situation. But I think in their case, they're not willing to do what it takes to fix it. And I suppose really what I'm hoping is that those colleagues, and there are many, dozens and dozens of Tory MPs who are hoping against hope that sort of Micawber-like something will come up to redeem the situation, are jolted by these findings into recognising that we actually have to act on something rather than simply hope if we're to change things.
Let me throw you another YouGov poll, which was commissioned in November after the government's policy was ruled unlawful. And this was around asking all adults. 39% said scrap the policy entirely. Another 14% said something else. So when you talk about doing the right thing or trying to get the right amendments or working for the British people, obviously it's not about what the majority of the British people think, is it? Only 29% of that poll said, try and find another way or another country. 39% saying scrap the policy altogether.
Well, I mean, some of those people will be people who adopt a position where they're just wholly against it as an idea, as a concept. Some of them will also be people who are just worn down by our repeated inability to make it happen. And I think there are lots of people on the centre-right who will just have come to the view that this whole thing has become so mired in the quagmire of both our domestic and international human rights commitments, that we aren't going to get it to happen. And
but maybe you should be listening to that. I mean, this is another part of that same poll. To what extent do you support or oppose the government's proposed policy, send some asylum seekers to Rwanda? 24% strongly support, 18% somewhat support, strongly opposes 28%, don't know is 19%, strongly opposes 11%. So actually, if you take that as a whole, there is no clear message coming from the British public telling you, the Conservative Party, that you need to harden up the Rwanda policy. There just isn't.
There is a clear message, however, from those parts of the electorate who might conceivably vote Conservative in a general election, that immigration is too high. What's so interesting is when
loads of people think immigration's too high. That's not the same as an endorsement of a more strict Rwanda policy, which
it means it means many things. I think with respect to I think it means we need to do more on legal migration. And I welcome the action the government took before Christmas on that. But I do also think it means we've got to show that we can effectively address the huge problem we face of illegal immigration, which is not going to be fixed, I'm afraid, by issues which are all about just dealing with the consequences of it rather than dealing with the causes of it.
Your government is fixated on this one area of wanting to stop the boats or want to stop illegal migration.
There's lots of other stuff happening. I mean, that's important to say. So there's lots of work with the French law enforcement agencies. There's work with, there was action late last year with the Bulgarian law enforcement agencies to stop the purchase of dinghies.
But what I'm saying is that this poll, everything that we're seeing in the last 24 hours and that we'll see this week is about the Rwanda policy. It's like there is this blinker going on in the Conservative Party where it's either toughen up the Rwanda policy or else you don't care about
I don't think so, but I think when you make a clear promise, and the Prime Minister did, to stop the boats, and when you say that your central policy on this is Rwanda, which is obviously not just something that Rishi said, it's something that Liz and Boris said before him, and when I've been on the doorsteps, like my colleagues, saying we're going to, work hard to make this work, I think it does come down to a fundamental issue, not just of trust in us, but trust in politics more generally. Can you deliver? And, I look at this poll, and obviously it shows a big surge in support for reform. And that surge in support for reform will cost, on this poll's evidence, 96 Conservative seats.
Are you yours included?
Mine included.
Yeah,
absolutely, mine included. And people in Middlesbrough, South and East Cleveland, I totally respect the strength of feeling, which I heard again on the doorstep this weekend. It is not enough for us to simply, argue in theoretical terms that, if you vote for reform, you'll get Labour by default. That happens to be true, but it won't convince people. The only way we'll stop it is if we show, and this is my point, why it matters so much, show that we are prepared to actually do what it takes.
Okay, so let's do the what ifs, and it's not a ridiculous what if, and you can't say that's a hypothetical.
No.
But what if...
I'm not. I never do, actually.
Okay, fine.
I tend to be fairly straight on
All
this.
right, well, what if Rishi Sunak doesn't accept the amendments?
Yeah, well...
What are you going to do?
Well, the first thing to say is obviously let's hope that he does, because I think that is important to say, and there are conversations ongoing, and I hope we might get somewhere. If he doesn't, then I think we are into the zone where a number of us will need to make a decision about whether we can support the bill at third reading. I'm clear that I can't, as it stands.
You will vote against.
So then there is a decision purely and simply to be made about abstention as opposed to voting against. I am minded, as things stand today, to vote against, because I don't believe it will work, and I don't think it's right that we should march the British public up the hill again, and this will be the third time now that we'll have tried to legislate.
And how many of your
failed.
colleagues?
Exactly.
Well, that's the question. To say I can't put words in the mouths of others.
What's your
I think it will be a genuinely important and consequential discussion over the next 72 hours as to how we proceed. I know for a fact there are other people who feel likewise. There will be others who feel that they're only happy to abstain. But it will be a significant body of Conservative MPs who won't be able to support the legislation as it stands. Now,
what was that, like 30, 60?
Well, I'm not running a book on the numbers, but it's a significant number of colleagues. Let's put it like that.
Grant Shapps will be, that's for sure.
Grant may well be with this famous pivot table.
Yes, look, I just want to come back to you on that, because it seems to me that, all through the Brexit negotiations, all through those critical votes, actually, what was the European Reform Group? They did know numbers.
Yeah.
I mean, I just wonder what your assessment is of the strength of support.
There are others, not myself, who are keeping a very close tab on
and
the
it
numbers.
takes 29 to vote against the government.
That's right. I mean, obviously, the reason why I'm slightly caveating all of this is it requires the opposition as well. So in some ways, of course, it's not just what we do, it's what the Labour Party does. And even if the Labour Party adopts one particular position or another, do they have a full turnout, etc., etc.? So there's quite a lot of caveats in all of this, right? And where are DUP for, where are the Lib Dems for? But the truth of the matter is, just on its own merits, just as a matter of being able to look my constituents in the eye, I will only be able to support this bill and say this time you can believe us if I believe that personally. And at the moment, because of the profusion of individual claims and because of the disinclination the government has shown to say that interim injunctions of the Strasbourg court will not be binding, I can't say that at the moment.
Fine. And because of that disinclination of the government, and it's possible that the government will get it through on third reading, but maybe with a substantially reduced majority, or it's possible that on third reading the government would be defeated, in which case you've got a major crisis for the government. Would you accept that it would be a major crisis?
It would be a really major crisis, yeah, it would. And that's why it's so desirable that over the period between now and Wednesday, the government should find a way of accommodating these changes, which I don't believe, incidentally, really change the parameters of the legislation as drafted.
And if there is a major crisis, we've seen Conservative Home article today, a leadership ballot, the game's afoot. Is that a logical corollary?
Well, I think there's as always with these things, there's a whole series of elements which need to be weighed in the balance here, and no one approaches these questions lightly. But what is crystal clear to me is that where we are today is not sustainable. We are on course for a shattering defeat, and the public is utterly switched off by promises which don't then materialise, right? The Prime Minister made his 5 pledges, of which this was perhaps the most iconic, to stop the boats, and we have to deliver against it. Now, I accept totally that some of these things take time, and I'm prepared to make that argument, to defend that argument passionately if needs be, but I can't do it if I don't believe that the government is doing its part, which means actually doing its damnedest to make that happen. And if I frankly see a piece of legislation which on their own estimation, which obviously often, I'm afraid, experience shows has been too optimistic, is only 50-50 to succeed, then I think it's really difficult to make the case that we are on course to deliver, and therefore, in turn, it's really difficult to make the case that we are on course to, get into a situation where we can win the next election. And I think, in the same way that lots of people were making these arguments, frankly, in the autumn of 2022, when the Truss government was in such dire trouble, or indeed in the summer of 2022 when people were trying to remove Boris Johnson. Look, in the end, we are about winning, right? Politics is about winning, and there's not much point in going to an elections if you are, frankly, on a hiding to an absolute shellacking. And I want a Conservative government. I think that Keir Starmer has none of the answers, really, that this country needs to what are really quite serious questions. I don't think the country is particularly persuaded by Labour, but they're going to get them by default with a stonking majority unless the Conservative Party up our game.
So do you think you have more of a chance of winning without Rishi Sunak in charge of your party?
I think we have more of a chance of winning if we deliver on the promises that we have made. Now, the question of the leadership is obviously connected, but is also, if you like, subsidiary to that point. If we get a bill through in the days ahead, and ultimately I wouldn't be at all cross if the government were to say we want a bit more time to go away to come back with a tougher bill. That would be fine. But the point is, I can't just sit here and say everything's fine when it's not.
So if they delay it, you will take that as a sort of victory this week?
I wouldn't regard it as a victory. I just regard it as a necessary step to try and deliver the right outcome.
Can I ask you, Rishi Sunak was asked a couple of weeks ago, and part of the thing that you're trying to toughen up is curtailing personal applications.
Yes.
So that if people are told they have to go, they can't get hold of their lawyers and sort of delay the whole thing.
Correct.
Would you like to see the Prime Minister say, even if lawyers tell us we can't get these flights off the ground, we just get them off the ground? Would you like to see him say they're going to go?
I believe in the rule of law, so I think the legislation needs to be to be. I don't think you can just disregard the legislation, as it were. I think we need to have a bill whereby we significantly amend sections 4 and 5 of the draft legislation so that those personal appeal rights are much more tightly limited. So, I mean, no one is disputing, for example, that if someone arrives with a advanced cancer, for example, that they ought not to be put on that flight to Rwanda. No one disputes that. And no one disputes that if someone is put on a flight because of a case of mistaken identity, that they shouldn't be put on that flight. But that's not how the bill is currently drafted. The bill is currently set up so that if you can cite any one of a plausible myriad of reasons why you yourself cannot safely go to Rwanda.
Okay, I'm
then
asking about
the
the rule
legal
of law,
profession will
essentially.
seize on it. So I believe in the rule of law. I think the law itself then needs to be right so that we are able to constrain the appeal rights and then act in accordance with the law. I certainly don't believe that the government can or indeed in practice could argue for disregarding the law.
Fascinating.
Thanks,
you.
John. Thanks, Emily.
Thank you. I thought Simon was very cautious when he didn't actually call for Rishi Sunak's head. He didn't say he wanted a change of leader, but he does want him to get the policy sorted out. I think there is probably a wider thing going on, which is that many of those who were appointed under Boris Johnson still don't entirely get the point of Rishi Sunak. They're having problems explaining to their own voters, to their constituents, what Rishi Sunak is for, what he stands for, and why they should back his plan when they can't even explain the plan to each other.
Look, people like Simon Clarke are in the business of trying to get a win over the amendments to the Rwanda policy. And it would be foolish for him to come in here and say, I think Rishi's a loser and he's got it all wrong. But I'm sure there are plenty of people on his wing of the party who think exactly that. And they think that what Rishi Sunak has done with the last cabinet reshuffle is skewed it much more to the centre of politics, with David Cameron and James Cleverly as Home Secretary and the rest, Grant Shapps as Defence Secretary, and that it's not representative of the Conservative Party in Parliament. And what I've heard people say is that you've got a cabinet that's to the left of the Conservative Party backbenchers, which itself is to the left of the Conservative Party membership, which itself is to the left of where an awful lot of Conservative voters are in the country.
I think this all goes back to Rwanda and Boris Johnson. Essentially, the Boris Johnson cabinet was much more firmly supportive of the Rwanda policy. If you look around the cabinet now, Grant Shapps, David Cameron, Gillian Keegan, James Cleverly, who we know thinks the whole thing is rubbish. We can look at Victoria Prentice, you can look at Victoria Atkins. The cabinet is now full of people who aren't massive advocates of the Rwanda policy, who probably find it all quite embarrassing and quite overblown, quietly want it to sort of, go away or just be sort of background noise to a better story that they hope they could tell on the economy. And there are the people like Simon Clarke who represent much more sort of Brexit-based seats or much more immigration-focused seats, even if they don't particularly have a lot of immigrants in that area, who want to see what Boris Johnson promised and don't understand why Rishi Sunak isn't delivering. This doesn't, of course, mean that's where the country is. So Simon Clarke is talking about a threat to them coming from reform, right? Labour doesn't really care if there's a threat to the Conservatives coming from reform, because Labour doesn't feel that threatened by reform, and actually it makes their job easier.
Before we go, tomorrow we will be in the minus 26 degrees of Iowa with a wind chill of minus 40 as America votes in its first caucus. We won't. We won't wrap up warm. We'll be in kind of leisure clothes, in T-shirts and shorts for the podcast. But in Iowa itself, it's bloody freezing, but it's also bloody important. So we'll be covering what happens there.
Yeah, and I think, we quite often talk about what impact will the weather have on election turnout. And in the UK, we kind of go, Labour voters might have to walk more and it might be a bit slippy and a bit cold and wet. It's a totally different thing when you're actually talking about whether that can kill you. Because in a caucus, you don't just go out to vote, you go out to actually debate and argue, and you spend sort of 2 or 3 hours in a room doing this. We should also point out there are 2 NFL games on. There's a 4:30 NFL game and an 8:15 NFL game, which might give you another reason to not think it's worth bracing minus 30 degrees to
the
go.
The NFL factor, I hadn't
the
thought
NFL
about.
Factor, this is what my teenage son tells me.
Yeah, and it's MLK Day today as well. So
lots of initials. But I guess the point is that when we talk about, who's going to do well, and Trump has this extraordinary lead in Iowa, and huge excitement amongst his followers for him. 49% of his supporters say that they will go out and turn out for him. You might not believe that. You're shaking your head.
Shaking your head. I'm shaking my head. I know that he's got into huge enthusiasm and Nikki Haley hasn't.
Nikki Haley's only got 9% on that reading, which suggests that a lot of people who are giving their vote to Nikki Haley might be lending their vote to Nikki Haley, and they may in fact give their vote to Couch
No, I think
or
you're wrong.
Sofa.
Wrong.
You
I think it's the
they'll
other way
get out?
around. I think that because Donald Trump is so far out in front, you think he's going to win anyway. Bloody hell, I'm not putting on my parka, my thermals and everything else to go to the caucus tonight. I'll
So
stay
it's
at
the
home
complacency vote.
because Donald Trump's got it all sewn up.
So you think Couch wins over Donald Trump, do you?
Well, I think Couch could win over Donald Trump, but
And I think
we shall report on
DeSantis
this tomorrow.
weirdly comes through the middle if that happens. We are going to be up all night. Some of us can be up all night.
Yeah,
listening,
Emily will
watching.
be.
Yeah, a little bit. I'm quite excited. We'll be back with the News Agents USA tomorrow, because how could we not bring you the results on the day that we get them, and on the main show too. See you then.
Bye-bye.
The News Agents. This is a Global Player original podcast.